Finally saw the original Gladiator in the cinema a few weeks before the sequel came out. It was interesting hearing so many refer to Gladiator as Ridley Scott's bid to bring back the sword and sandals epics of the 50s and 60s, but also to see a prominent criticism of the film being its historical inaccuracy. I mean, how many of the original slate were based on biblical tales and Greek legends? The world building encompassing the revenge plot is pretty clearly designed to evoke as much comparison to the modern age as humanly possible. Although I'm sure you can dig deep to find interesting political parallels, I was mostly preoccupied with how a supposed pastiche to a bygone era of cinema seemed to be largely critical of the landscape that produced them. Ruling over a once glorious empire that desperately needs to change to survive, the newest emperor, immediately after seizing his inheritance, proves how unknowledgeable he is by ignoring all his advisors about the financial ruin they are facing and instead falls back on tradition and drawing people's eyes to grandiose spectacle. I mean, it feels like a critique of 60s Hollywood. And nearly 25 years on from that film, I half expected that the chance to do that again may have been what drew Scott back to making a sequel. With scenes like the water-filled Colosseum featuring prominently in the trailers, I was half expecting him to double down on this critique of Hollywood never learning from their mistakes and repeating them ad nauseum. The only question being where the buck would stop. If the sea battle reenactment can be seen as a shot at more extravagant special effects, perhaps the seating in the Colosseum would be customized to make the spectator's experience more comfortable or involving. Maybe more people than ever are prone to setting up their own gladiatorial matches in the streets and their own homes, and the stadiums are struggling to compete. Nah. What's featured in the trailers is pretty much all they have in terms of ramping up the spectacle. I was kind of banking on this being the main subtextual focus on Gladiator II, though, because otherwise it does just kind of double down on the first film's perception of a waning empire in its autumn years, framing the fearless warrior not as the ideal leader, but as a mirror to be held up and highlight the weaknesses and inadequacies of the current crop of leadership. Where the gladiator is resourceful, scrappy, and an adept survivor, the emperors are pampered and frail, lacking in any real semblance of independence. The more the people revere the gladiator, the less they can bring themselves to worship and admire the emperors. It could also be argued that the sequel makes the masculine-feminine contrast more prominent in this one as well. Where Commodus was himself a capable fighter and his most villainous traits were his incestuous behavior, Macrinus and the Emperor twins are made to be at least somewhat more explicitly queer-coded and effeminate respectively. Although you could argue, particularly in the twins' case, that the aim is to make them feel like children, contrasted with the grown men Hanno and Acacius. The major changes are that the action sequences are shot much more clearly in this film than the first. There's a more multi-pronged assortment of characters and motivations coming to blows as the story develops, and the attitude to succession and improving a broken system have shifted dramatically. The first Gladiator was all about getting rid of the bad apple from the unspoiled bunch, making room for a fairer system to nestle into the power vacuum that Maximus creates. Here, despite the fact that in this instance our hero has a more direct claim to power than Maximus, Hanno's distancing from and disillusionment with the powers that be promote a more anarchic viewpoint, condemning all who seek to rule. But not dissimilarly from Megalopolis, the hero's status as a born ruler and the absence of a real voice for the ordinary subject of Rome leads to this call for change feeling a little muted. Hanno's multifacetedness derives from his status as a royal and as a soldier. The idea that the bourgeoisie will be supplanted by the military doesn't evoke a real feeling of change, given that in both this film and its predecessor, the military is still very much dedicated to maintaining the existing structure of power. Gladiator II, then, is more provocative than the first film, but ultimately no more curious.